This is what I'm going to try and get through in 15 minutes, but when I was asked to talk about assessment, I was reminded that to pass Year 6 PE, our assessment was to do a handspring off of the vault box. And I talked to our pre-service teachers around how we were assessed at Teachers College. So to pass first year gymnastics, we had to be able to get onto the parallel bars, do a side straddle, and then do a dismount. In second year, that progressed to being able to do onto the bars, a side straddle, a forward roll, and then into a dismount. And they look at me going, seriously? You're expected to be able to do that in your teacher preparation? And I go, yeah, I failed. My first year, first semester topic, I failed my assessment in physical education to be a phys ed teacher because I couldn't get 60% from the free throw line in the basketball skills test. I ended up getting 60% when I did my supplementary assessment. I got the left-hand layup, the right-hand layup, the dribbling skills, and all those sorts of things. To this day, I still can't play basketball, but I did all of the tests really well except from the free throw line because we'd never done basketball at school. Hello, basketball had never been part of our prac. The point that I'm making there is we tend to assess what we value. Assessment is one of the ways we communicate to families, to children, to administrators, to the community, the things that we actually think are important in our phys ed programs. And 30 plus years ago when I was training to be a phys ed teacher, what was important was technical competence. Technical competence was important for the kids. Technical competence was expected of the phys ed teacher because it was expected that we couldn't ask the kids to do what we couldn't do ourselves. We weren't able to stand up in front of the kids and do it. We shouldn't have been asking them to do it. What we now know that we've got standardised curriculum frameworks in most countries in the world is that a skills test of technique maps to around about year 4 or 5, where they're asked to demonstrate skills in closed situations in order for the competency component to be directed. So after about year 4 or 5, skills tests no longer become authentic assessment tasks because the nature of what we're asking young people to do moves from the demonstration of isolated skills into skills in context. So in essence, we're having a conversation about what is this thing called assessment all about. And I'm one of the people that would argue that assessment is part of our educative purpose. Assessment communicates the difference between us as physical educators and people who are providing an activity experience where no more is expected of the kids to get a light sweat and a bit of a puff, high step counts, and then they come away, they were busy, they were happy, they were active. We don't need to be phys ed teachers. Phys ed teachers are about education. Education is about learning. Learning is about change. Change requires challenge. Change requires stretch. Change requires putting people into situations where they're uncomfortable so that they learn to become comfortable. So we get new capabilities, new ideas, new growth, new understanding as a consequence of that disruption of the comfort. So as physical educators, if we're not making young people uncomfortable, we're not providing the stretch that provides the growth, therefore the opportunity for us to measure learning. So assessment is absolutely part of our quality teaching. It demonstrates part of the quality of our teaching, but it absolutely communicates the educative purpose of what we do in physical education. So if student learning is our prime responsibility as educators, assessment is part of our educative responsibility. So having established that key point, assessment is always at the heart of quality learning. Because without assessment, we are guessing what's happening with the young people and their learning. We're guessing maybe because our bias and our interpretation and what we want to see rather than what's actually there. So assessment is one way that we demonstrate accountability as educators regardless of what subject we teach. So yes, assessment is serious business because it is part of our quality assurance of what we're doing. Providing evidence that something has changed as a result of this intervention which we call physical education teaching. So one of the really important questions that need to be asked of every physical education program, regardless of age group, is what are we assessing in physical education, and are we assessing the things that actually matter in growing the competence of young people to choose to be physically active now and at some stage into the future? And it doesn't matter what curriculum framework you look around the world for the last 40 to 50 years, they all communicate essentially the same continuum of learning. First of all, we need to make sure that children have fundamental movement skills under coordination and control. The literature is absolutely clear. If young people do not have fundamental movement skills under coordination and control, they are likely to choose to be inactive because they have no confidence in themselves as physically active beings. So once we have the fundamental movement skills under control, we're putting those into movement sequences. So fundamental movement skill of running, fundamental movement skill of tracking a ball, fundamental movement skill of stopping a ball, and the fundamental movement skill of throwing the ball to a target becomes a sequence in a game of T-ball or rounders or Kanga cricket. So we're putting those fundamental movement skills into sequences which we call games. From there, we take those movement sequences and we specialise them into activities that are called rollerblading and surfing and skateboarding and windsurfing and tennis and hockey and cricket. But there are so many specialised applications that we can do that if we go a mile wide and an inch deep, the children don't actually learn anything in PE because there hasn't been enough time for learning to occur. There's been lots of experiences, maybe a lot of busy, active, happy, good, but no learning, because learning takes time. Learning takes repetition in order for the consolidation, the reoccurrence of the experience, makes it stick, makes it consolidate, and then we have learning that actually occurs. And then finally, we expand that capacity to take responsibility for physical activity experiences, but also the provision of physical activity experiences by giving people specialised roles. And we talked in one of the workshops today about an ideal model for that being the sport education framework. But in most curriculum frameworks, we have the movement competency that we're assessing, but we also have something about understanding what physical activity is and the importance of it. So we move from helping people understand why the body acts in particular ways when we're active, how those reactions are important to our health now and in the future. We then enable people to plan, to take action, to be physically active, and then the capacity to evaluate the worthwhileness of those plans that they're putting into place. I did a quick scan before I came here. There is no curriculum framework anywhere in the world that asks us to fitness test young people and to report their fitness. And that makes sense too. Because of growth and development, a 13-year-old could be biologically 16 or biologically 7. So it makes no sense to do a standardised fitness test and report on all the kids doing the same test because they're not biologically the same age. They might be chronologically the same age, but they are not biologically the same age. Assessment can then form three functions for us. It can be the assessment of the learning that has occurred, a snapshot of the growth and development. It can be assessment for learning, where it feeds into the learning goals and feeds into our planning of curriculum to keep the learning progressing. And as we looked at in the workshop earlier today, the assessment can actually be the learning because the assessment provides the individual student with the reflection that enables them to focus on their needs now and in the future as learners. So assessment has those three functions, but those three functions can occur within a single task. Those tasks don't have to be three different tasks to achieve those three functions of assessment. And I've just summarised very quickly up there what those three functions are when we put them into practice. But most people understand assessment of, for and as learning, but what we need to understand is that for assessment to have real value, it needs to be authentic because it's measuring a real situation. It needs to be purposeful because the learner understands the criteria and the alignment to learning. It needs to have validity because it's actually chosen because it's fit for purpose assessment. It's reliable because if somebody other than me does it with my class, they will get the same results. So there's consistency regardless of the teacher that's implementing it. And it's objective because it's free of bias. Regardless of whose lens is put on it and whose filter and paradigm of the world, the same results will occur. So if the assessment that you're designing for your children can tick those 5 boxes, then you are doing quality assessment and you are meeting the educative purpose that assessment provides in our physical education classes. So we can have tasks which are assessment as learning, where we actually map and heat track the movement patterns that people are doing in class to provide them with actual real data, the same sort of data that we use in academy programs and elite programs to enable people to understand their movement patterns and talk to them about that. We can also do coding of their achievements within class, and we can do that via ICT perspectives. But that also becomes assessment for learning, because we know that the people who do the bench coaching and the tagging are also thinking about what that means for their own performance, and after they provide that feedback to their peers, they then go into the game further knowledgeable and focusing on things that matter to them, having given that feedback to somebody else. So bench coaching becomes assessment of learning as well as assessment for learning. Now, to finish off with, we know most national and international contexts now have standardised curricula, which means that there's a statement that we work back from when we think about our assessment, because we're making a judgment about that standard and the performance of that standard. So best practice asks us to start with the nouns and the verbs of the competency statement or the achievement statement or the student assessment statement. And by looking at the verbs, we actually see the cognitive actions that the learner is required to demonstrate in order to be at standard. When we focus on the nouns, we get an indication of the type of content that we're allowing the experience of or developing the knowledge of. So one of the things that we can look at in our standardised curriculum is to go, in this one here, what are the verbs for cognitive action? So when you're reading that, I want you to be thinking as you look at that statement, what are the verbs for the cognitive actions? What are the nouns for the content? Because that tells you what you're building as your curriculum experience. What are the key concepts that sit underneath those nouns that create the depth of content for the unit of work? Having thought of that, what assessment tasks give you valid, reliable, authentic and objective data to make an assessment of where the children are at in their progress towards, achievement of, or progress past that standard of competency? So these are the things that we do as educational designers to make high quality educational spaces. We bring a backwards by design focus by understanding the statement of learning intent, using that in our planning to understand the content but also the level of achievement that is expected. We then design the assessment tasks, both the formative that we'll use continuously and the summative that will capture a measure at a particular point so we can communicate to our stakeholders. And then we build the content of the curriculum to enable the scaffolding so the young people can achieve the achievement standard. That's all I've got time for today. We'll be unpacking more of those ideas about assessment when we do the secondary workshop on assessment tomorrow, and I talked about some of the other aspects in the elementary primary one today. But to finish with again, I can't emphasise enough that part of our communication of our educative purpose and the quality of our physical education programs is the type of assessment that we are designing, because assessment communicates not only a measure of what the students are doing, it also communicates quite clearly to people what we believe is important in the education of young people. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat today.